Our next contribution is from Mark Taylor, who's the Principal Business Associate at Education at Eversheds. Mark has heroically stepped in because his colleague Glenn has been switched away for client business, something about making money, which of course none of us are used to. The original remit was to give some insights from the legal governance and other perspectives of what might come through in the HE bill, but there was also an instruction to any insight on the implications of Brexit that are coming through. So, Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Neil. I'm afraid if we've gone from academics to business people to talking about bankers to moving on to MPs, you're now stuck with a lawyer. I'm not sure what that leaves next. Maybe there's an estate agent this afternoon. If I'm talking about Brexit, I think the only word I want everybody to remember is uncertainty. Nobody is quite sure what the legal impact of Brexit on the higher education system will be. The best analogy I heard of this was of a group of friends standing round 1 o'clock in the morning in a really, really bad nightclub. So they're standing there, everybody's drinking Austrian wine that's probably been doctored with antifreeze. They're listening to really loud German techno music, and the people next to them are smoking Gauloise cigarettes. They're all together, but nobody's enjoying it. And one of them, the charismatic friend, says, I know, we should go somewhere better. He convinces everybody that this is a terrible nightclub, we can do a lot better than this. So they all leave. They walk out of the nightclub at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it's raining. So they go along to the next nightclub next door, and they're told, well, no, your shoes aren't good enough. They try another one. By that point, it's pushing 2 o'clock in the morning, and they're not allowed in. Everywhere's closed. So 2:30 in the morning, they find themselves in a fight in the local kebab shop. I'd say that's about where we are with Brexit at the moment. We're all standing round in a nightclub. Nobody quite likes the nightclub, but we're all together, and perhaps we're better just sticking where we are. At the moment, a charismatic friend has told us that it's time for us to leave. We all know we're going to leave, but we don't know if we'll be let in next door. We don't know if it's raining, and we don't know if we're going to end up in a fight in the kebab shop. So, why this uncertainty? And actually that comes back to the legal technicalities of Brexit. As soon as we give notice to leave the EU, there is a 2-year period during which we can negotiate our exit. Now that period can be extended, but to extend it, you need the permission of every single member state. So that immediately puts the UK on the back foot and puts us at a disadvantage when negotiating that exit. And actually the really interesting point, I think, is that 2-year negotiation is just getting out. That isn't what our relationship will be like with Europe in the future. So if we're talking about trade deals, that can only be negotiated after that 2-year period, once we are out. Because at the moment, legislative competence for negotiating that trade deal sits with Europe. We can't do it. So we have 2 years to negotiate getting out, and then we can start to think about the future. Now, that is the law, but I see it a bit like the football transfer window. Yes, there is a set window during which you can do a transfer and negotiate a deal, but actually everybody knows that you're talking to rival clubs beforehand and things will be spoken about even if you can't sign a deal. So what don't we know about the impact of Brexit on the UK and on the higher education sector? Firstly, there's the European laws which have been implemented into UK law. Anything which has been implemented under the European Communities Act, we will lose on Brexit. So we now have the choice as to whether or not we choose to put that back into UK law. Those European laws which have been directly implemented by way of a UK Act of Parliament, we won't lose, but we could amend them if we chose to. European case law, we would lose. There would be no reference to that. So again, how will our judges interpret law, which has been set by European judges over the previous period? What don't we know about business and the HE sector? Well, first of all, attracting and retaining staff. I think this is going to be most acute at the young researcher level. Those people who are relatively mobile, can choose the country in which they work. Will we be able to attract European researchers to come over to and work in the UK, because they are absolutely vital to the HE economy. We could talk about whether or not existing EU staff of a university could be thrown out on Brexit, but I think that's the one bit where I cannot see that being in anybody's best interest, and I think it is really unlikely. How's about attracting students to the UK? I personally was a very proud Erasmus student. Will we lose access to the Erasmus programme? It does seem pretty likely. Some universities in the UK are reliant on EU students coming over and studying in the UK. What will happen to those universities? And actually, will universities choose to charge differential fees for European students? Because at the moment, they're charged at the home level. And actually, if they are charged at the higher level, will the increase in fee mitigate the fewer numbers that we could see coming across? Research funding. Everybody welcomes the government's promise to guarantee research funding, but actually that doesn't go quite far enough. I've been speaking to researchers who've already lost the ability to work on projects because a lot of projects are collaborative across Europe, and if you were a European researcher, quite rightly you'd be nervous about collaborating with a UK researcher because you don't know what the future holds for them. And so I know of projects for the UK which have already failed because of that. The European Investment Bank hasn't been spoken about much, but it seems very unlikely that UK universities will be able to borrow from the European Investment Bank in the future. And if you look at capital builds across UK campuses, a lot of them have been funded with EIB loans. Private providers and Brexit, personally, I can't see a huge impact on private providers with Brexit. Not that many private providers in the UK are reliant on EU students, and very few private providers have a lot of research income. I think the higher education and research bill is a much bigger issue for private providers, although Brexit probably isn't a good idea for attracting investment into the UK HE from private providers, because if there's one thing private investors don't like, it's uncertainty. So what do we know then? Well, we do know that UK laws, such as freedom of information, which don't have any European basis, will continue. There will be no change to that, I'm sorry to say, for the public HE sector. There are other laws, like treaty-based laws, for example, the European Patents Office. Again, that will not be affected post-Brexit. I'm afraid the one piece of bad news we definitely know about is that there is almost certainly going to be legislative backlog before and after Brexit. If we talk about the European laws which have been implemented by way of a UK Act of Parliament, do we want to keep those or not? Somebody has to take the decision on every single one of those laws as to whether or not we want to implement it here, and then there will need to be an Act of Parliament to implement those we want to keep. And we're talking roughly in the region of 7,000 of those. Now, when I heard that, I immediately thought that actually perhaps the higher education and research bill's at risk if there will be this parliamentary backlog, but actually it looks like that backlog will be later and the higher education and research bill will get through before then. What do we know about the future of business for the HE sector? Well, from a legal perspective, the one thing we know businesses must be doing now is looking at your contracts. For a couple of different reasons. If you have a really important contract which has a force majeure clause in it, could that be triggered on Brexit? Actually, lots of important contracts, for example, most institutions borrowing, will have a change of law clause in there. That if there is a change of law which can detrimentally affect your lender, they will have the ability to call in the loan. I think in most instances that's very likely to have been triggered. So something we're doing with quite a lot of businesses and universities at the moment is going through their contracts and actually trying to work out what the impact of Brexit could be on each one. Likewise, future contracts, if we're not quite sure about the effect of Brexit on existing contracts, we at least want to be sure that universities are going to be entering into new contracts with clauses which would protect them on Brexit. I don't like being all doom and gloom, so I tried to think of some better news, and it took quite a lot of head scratching, I'm afraid. We came up with a couple of ideas. Firstly, legislative flexibility. Once the UK is out of Europe, we will have the ability to implement laws independently of Europe. So, for example, if we take direct tax, which aren't European laws already, but are affected by competition law. So you look at Ireland and the Apple scenario where they are having to tax Apple and they don't want to. Post-Brexit, could the UK try and set itself up with differential laws so that we will attract businesses such as them to this country? And could that affect the universities? I think that is quite likely, although the flip side to that argument is that following Brexit, businesses such as that will be less likely to invest in the UK because they won't be able to move their staff in and out as freely. I think there could be changes to other laws which could affect universities, and some of it could be positive. Take, for example, VAT, which is a European-based law. At the moment, UKHE has to charge VAT on amounts it pays to overseas agents, and that goes back to the European law on it. Could we amend that so actually the VAT bill's differential? Taking private providers and pathway providers, at the moment, some charge VAT on their tuition fees, others don't, and try and get around it using, again, European law. We would have the flexibility to amend that law so that we can choose whether or not those pathway providers are able or do have to charge VAT on their tuition fees. I was interested in the comment about UKHE and universities merging into the UK, and that's something we've been talking about and expecting for a very long time. How's about we turn that on its head, though? How's about UK universities merge with European counterparts? It isn't such a great leap to think of a big London university merging with a Parisian Grande École. If a university were to do that, would it then have the ability to attract the European research funding, which it could then be excluded from? Actually, there are some UK universities which already have significant European campuses. Can that be used for delivery of a UK degree within Europe so that there are no travel restrictions on those students and the fees being charged at a local level? That's something we're talking to quite a lot of universities about at the moment. And if you do have that campus, is it possible to actually try and apply for degree awarding powers in that local jurisdiction so that, again, you can attract the research funding through that campus? That's it. Thank you.
Okay.